And now, The Good, the Bad, and the Weird presents
a brief or semi-brief history of Lord of the Rings movie adaptations.
Yes.
Yeah, I have been excited for this. This is the start of the big project that we have hinted at for a few months at this point.
Yes, we're finally going to tackle it.
Yeah, we are doing the Peter Jackson adaptation of Lord of the Rings. But before we get into that, real quick, I'm your host, Nico.
And I'm Chris.
Yes. But we wanted to go through kind of a brief history of the franchise itself and its adaptations.
Mm-hmm.
Because it's a little bit more interesting than, Peter Jackson created this stuff.
Yes.
Or didn't even create it, adapted it. And
also, Lord of the Rings in general has impacted more than just the Peter Jackson films. And in a more in-depth way than I think any of the movies we've talked about yet.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I mean, I've had some thoughts on this, and we'll get into that when we actually get into the main episodes. But this is such a big trilogy, and a lot of millennials, and we're not even, are we millennials?
We are technically elder millennials.
Elder millennials. Obey us, youngins. But these movies have a special spot in a good chunk of our lives.
Oh yeah, they ate a lot of our youth. Mm-hmm. And they just kept coming out with more.
Yeah. And so before we just dive right into the Peter Jackson stuff, because we are relatively history nerds,
yeah,
we kind of wanted to do a brief discussion and just talk your ears off about the history of the franchise.
Yes.
And specifically, this spotlight will be covering the timeline from 1937 to 1999, when New Line took over production responsibilities. And we'll more so conclude with the legacy of the franchise and everything after Peter Jackson's in the 6th and final episode of the Lord of the Rings trilogy. And that's right, you heard it. We are doing 6 episodes on 3 movies.
Yeah, and I get it. When the movies came out, people complained that they were long. Mm-hmm. And then they complained they weren't long enough.
Yeah.
And then they complained The Hobbit was too long. And then people complained it was not long enough.
Yeah.
And so we thought about it. We thought about how to cut this as best we could. And there's too much.
Exactly.
To not do them in chunks.
Exactly. And we wanted to do the movies justice. And on top of that, we were focusing more on the design aspects of those movies.
Yeah.
Rather than the history of the movies and everything else, because there are plenty of other podcasts and YouTube channels that have done that better. But us as designers and architects wanted to do something more in line of what we do and how much we appreciate the world that they created through the architecture and design of those worlds.
Yeah, especially since for most people, the Peter Jackson was the gateway to the rest of what we're going to talk about today.
Exactly.
Because once we finished with those and had to either wait for more stuff to come out or are currently in the process of waiting for the new thing to come out, everyone has, whether or not you like to admit it, we've filled our time rewatching all of these other old stuff, finding out about these other books, these other shows.
Getting into other medieval fantasy style movies.
Which turned out to all be inspired by Lord of the Rings.
Or Nordic lore and their garbage.
Ah, yes. Good old garbage.
Oh, yeah. I just watched Sorceress for the first time.
Ah, yes. Okay, that explains it.
Yeah. So that's been my little rabbit hole of fantasy films. As well, we won't be going into full detail in each movie just because there are so many films that were made in between. But we do want to bring them up in the history because they're interesting offshoots of what eventually led up to Peter Jackson's.
And also very interesting the evolution of how this adaptations have happened. Because we've ranged from very straightforward adaptations all the way up to Peter Jackson's, which people would argue is pretty loose and wild.
Yeah, surprisingly, yes, as someone who is finally going through the books for once.
Yeah.
And also in this spotlight, we are only focusing on film and television adaptations. There's a plethora of other adaptations, including radios, video games, and even stage plays.
One musical.
No, there's multiple musicals.
Oh, really? I only found the one that I could watch, and
only one you could watch. There's musicals. There's play adaptations.
I know about the plays. Oof. There's a lot.
Yeah.
If you can think of a medium for this, it has been done.
Yeah. No, exactly. There's a video game. Yeah. I mean,
music, like, literally, you name it.
Mm-hmm. Oh, music inspired some of the adaptations, too.
And some of the names of the biggest music people that you know, like Led Zeppelin, were secretly giant nerds and have written songs about Lord of the Rings.
Yes, a lot of magic nerds.
A lot of magic nerds.
Speaking of big names, I have some other notes that I'll be adding in addition to non-Lord of the Rings information, just so that some of the names have context.
Yeah, that helps.
Just because there are some big names that were trying to do adaptations, specifically in the 70s.
Yeah.
And so, right into it.
Yes.
It all begins with the publishing of The Hobbit in 1937.
Which, if you are familiar with the Peter Jackson franchise, is not the one you're thinking that was first.
No, not at all. And real quick, my notes were from mainly Wikipedia and random news articles that I did not write the sources down for.
And I have a couple of history books on it, but again, most of it can be found very conveniently on not just Wikipedia, but also specifically the Tolkien Wikipedia.
Yeah, there's like 3 or 4 Tolkien Wikipedias as well.
Yeah, I mean, unless you're getting into real nitty-picky details, which we're gonna avoid, the information is readily available.
Yeah,
don't worry.
There's
much. There's no secrets anymore.
There's a handful, but
there
not
is.
Like super deep. They're not important secrets as much.
Exactly.
But before we really dive in, it is of note that Tolkien didn't feel his books could be dramatized. But along with his publishers, Allen and Unwin, they were open to giving the rights to people to see what they could do, but they initially were very cautious and held the rights to veto creative decisions.
Oh, yeah.
But for the right amount of money, they were like, we could maybe do something, as a lot of things are in life.
With that said, though, granted, when Tolkien was alive, I agree with him. I don't think the way he envisioned Lord of the Rings could be produced. I do think that we have come so far that I don't think that has, like, it would never have occurred to him what we can make now.
Oh yeah, no, not at all. I mean, we're talking like these are the days of like George Méliès is the pinnacle of special effects still. But it didn't take long for adaptations to be considered. No. The Hobbit was a huge success when it came out. Oh, yeah, exactly. And there were many letters that were received, and a lot of them were like, no, we're not going to do it. And in 1938, Disney actually had considered adapting The Hobbit, as well as there are memos suggesting that elements of The Hobbit were considered for incorporation into Fantasia, as well as Richard Wagner's Richard Wagner epic music drama Der Ring des Nibelungen. Yes. It's based off the Germanic folklore of Die Nibelungen and Siegfried. Yes. And Kriemhild. With that said, though, take the Fantasia part with a grain of salt, because everything that could have perceived as classical or fantasy was on the table for Fantasia, and unfortunately Fantasia flopped horribly, so, like, if there had been more, maybe we would have gotten it, but, like, Fantasia, we'll have to do a whole episode on Fantasia someday. I would like to at some point, because I still haven't finished it. I watched it that one Christmas party, and then... yes, I did throw it on once. Yeah, and then everyone started falling asleep, and we're like, we should probably go home. I think I'm probably the only person who actively watches Fantasia, like, on a regular basis still. I like the animation, it's just... That's the whole thing, though. It's just something nice to look at. Yeah. And it may be a little prophetic, but later published in 1977 in the New York Times article, will the video version Tolkien be Hobbit forming? I love a good pun. Disney never pursued the idea any further, as they decided against the project because the work lacked the kind of humor and audiences or it didn't have the audience expectations from what Disney could do with it. And because any attempt to alter Tolkien's story to interject such humor, they was thought to result in it would be bad, and there would be vocal resentment from Tolkien devotees. And they were completely right. Yes. They were 100% right, but also keep in mind that at the time with this for Disney, this was what we would call like the golden age of Disney. This was like old Disney. So we'd passed Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs era, but we're still not up to Lion King. Yeah.
So like we're in that gold sweet spot where there's a lot of adventure, there's a lot of interesting happening, but all of it is so heavily handed, like what we now think of like classic Disney G rating.
Yeah, we're outside the golden era, and this is well, even by the 70s it still was kind of in their golden era, because it wasn't until the 80s when they really started sending out those young adult videos and stuff.
Yeah, we didn't have anything close to that.
Yeah, full butt in one of them.
Yep, no butts at this point in Disney.
Nope. But also Disney wanted to make an adaptation of Lord of the Rings in the 50s, but that as well was deemed not on brand and too complex for what they could do in a children's story.
And again, in the 50s, Disney didn't do adult films.
No.
There was no adult sector, there was no Marvel sector of Disney. They were only kids.
Yeah.
So, yeah, doing a Lord of the Rings that's what we would now consider like G-rated, that'd be really hard.
Yeah.
That'd be almost impossible.
I could maybe see like a toned down Hobbit version.
I could see a toned down Hobbit. It'd be boring, but I could see it.
Yeah, well, and that's the thing. And it gets brought up a lot of like how to interpret Tolkien's work. And I agree.
Oh, sure.
I agree with Tolkien. As his writing is, it does not work as a movie adaptation.
No, especially if any of you have actually bothered to read, especially The Hobbit. The Hobbit, I think, is the fastest paced and the least detailed of his works.
Yeah.
And from there, it's just every blade of grass beautifully and descriptively detailed to you.
Unless you forgot to do it. Then
he forgot.
Then there's just reference and put in the appendices.
Yeah. Oh, there's so much flipping back and forth.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's not an easy read.
No.
And it's not necessarily something that jumps off of the page as something that, like, could be a movie.
Unless you're into that type of fantasy, so.
Yeah, and even then, like, we have other books that are like that, but it's so hard to move that sort of work onto film. Yeah,
especially nowadays. Because everything needs excitement and action and comedy.
Yeah, which was what Disney was looking for, but how do you get that out of what at the time was the original source?
Yeah, and especially from a author who's very hesitant to even give you the rights to begin with.
And not just that, but an author who is hesitant to give the rights, but also has so much behind their stories that you can't just take it and go.
Yeah.
There's too much world building back there that you might not realize you messed up.
Nope, exactly. And so also in 1956, film and television producer Al Brodux reached out to Tolkien with a proposal to adapt The Lord of the Rings, but nothing came of it despite Tolkien welcoming the idea.
Yeah.
And this is where we start to see really the softening up to adaptations.
Yeah. And some of this also was because Tolkien was quite a well-known socialite amongst the writing circles. And so some of his other friends' work had been successfully turned into plays and radio shows. And he was starting to see the different areas that this could be successful. Yeah,
and also, for example, as well, it's of note that, of note, at this point in time, the last volume of Lord of the Rings had only recently been published, and Tolkien was entering retirement. So his work hadn't really even reached the pinnacle of what we were going to see.
Exactly.
But yeah, it just didn't have that cultural significance. So I can see why nothing came of it. And for additional context, Brodux would later produce Popeye the Sailor cartoon in the 60s, as well as the Beatles television series and Yellow Submarine. I say this because all these have relations to Lord of the Rings adaptations.
Yes.
20, 30 years from this point.
Exactly.
And so also in 1956, science fiction writer Forrest Ackerman, who had coined the genre nickname sci-fi, also approached Tolkien for an adaptation or to adapt it into an animation. On board at the time, he had an amateur screenwriter, Morton Grady Zimmerman, and artwork from the American-Australian artist Ron Cobb, who most people know his concept artwork from Dark Star, Star Wars, Alien, Raiders of the Lost Ark, Conan the Barbarian, Back to the Future, Abyss.
Have you watched any movie between now and the 70s? You've seen some of his work.
Yeah, Total Recall, Southland Tales, just to name some.
Oh yeah, he's been behind a lot of stuff.
Yeah, he's a visionary artist. And, I mean, that was a big thing at the time.
Oh, yeah.
And as well, the concept for it would have been something more that we see nowadays.
Mm-hmm.
He wanted a 3-hour film with 2 intermissions.
And they bring intermissions back.
I actually agree. 100% I agree. And Ackerman already had done some scope sites in California for this.
Which I could see working.
Yeah.
I mean, it'd be interesting. I would really like to see it.
Yeah, and this attempt was actually important because this is the first one that actually gained any traction.
Mm-hmm.
But it was very rocky. As it was described, Tolkien was not a fan of Zimmerman's treatment and the condensing of his work, specifically reordering of events and characters.
Yeah.
And even cutting some major ones all out together.
Which is a theme we will revisit.
Yeah. Yeah, and also, like, I think they described, like, Lothlorien as being, like, a medieval castle or some shit.
Yeah, there was... And it is interesting to see the shift, and this is what we really want to focus on,
Mm-hmm.
but the visual and aesthetic shift between what was fantasy and how Tolkien's work changed fantasy.
Yeah.
Because even though Tolkien's work at this time, for a lot of people, still was the pinnacle of it, there wasn't a real visual representation of what all this looked like. You maybe got some cover work, art, and then you got the descriptions. Yeah.
And even then, if we talk about in that same vein, Jackson is the one who also interpreted and changed what fantasy movies would be in the U.S., or at least in cinema.
Yeah, which is interesting because a lot of people were working off of the concepts of things like Disney, which is a very, Germanic European concept of fantasy.
Yeah, or the old Jason and the Argonauts or Clash of the Titans.
Yeah, very either Germanic or Greek and Roman.
Very, what's his name? Blank on his name. The stop animation guy who did 2000, or the Beast from 2000 Fathom, or 20,000 Fathoms.
20,000 Fathoms.
Yeah. That stop animation, that was still the thing at the time.
Yeah.
That being said, of Tolkien not liking the reworking of his stuff, he did like the concept art.
Yes,
and
he did.
While Tolkien ultimately didn't want to outright kill the project, it never came to fruition as Ackerman couldn't find a producer to finance the project and couldn't afford to extend the lease on the rights itself.
Because even back then, they knew this was going to be pricey.
Yeah.
Like, there was no gentle way around making Lord of the Rings not expensive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, no, I mean, that's the thing with any fantasy production is they are expensive.
They are, even the low-budget ones.
Yeah, take, for example, the Fritz Lang epic Die Nibelungen.
Yes.
Which, again, referencing older fantasy movies. But that is still kind of the pinnacle of this era of film. And fun little bit of trivia, Ackerman had wanted to have a American International Production, or American International Pictures produce it, but it was rejected. But that year, they decided to produce It Conquered the World, The She Creature, Hot Rod Girls, Runaway Daughter, Shake, Rattle, and Shake, Rattle, and Rock, and the sexploitation / women in prison movie, Girls in Prison.
A good catalog.
Yeah. that all got in the way of Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, it always blows me away, the different groups who turn down things that later on or that could have changed them.
Yeah.
But at the same time, I'm glad they didn't take it, because...
with that lineup,
I think it would have been I don't think it would have been a strong contender.
No, not in the least. And so in 1956, there was brief negotiations between Tolkien and author Robert Gutwilling and producer Samuel W. Gelfman.
Yes.
But despite Tolkien being impressed by Gutwilling, nothing came of it after being directed to talk to the publishers of the books.
Who were also very protective of this book series.
Yeah.
They knew they had gold.
Oh, yeah. I mean, I completely understand that creating something so epic and just...
Yeah, you don't want to burn it too quickly.
You don't want to see it bastardized.
No, and also, from a book publisher's perspective, you don't want it ruined in the movie world when... Even though he says he's retired, there's a chance. There's always hope until the man is dead.
Oh, yeah.
And even afterwards.
Yeah. and other trivia as well, Gelfman also produced a women in prison film called Caged Heat.
Is that just, like, in so many people's repertoires? Like, somewhere under the rug, they're like, and I also have this one?
I mean...
It sneaks in there more than I would assume.
As someone who loves exploitation films, and shit, when we talked about The Cat Returns, almost the entire Japanese cast was tied to Takashi Miike in one way or another.
That's true. Once you know one person, you're kind of in, aren't you?
The 3 degrees of Takashi Miike.
True. Very true.
And so, finally, 30 years after the initial release, we have our first release of a Middle-earth movie.
Yes.
It was in 1967 with Rembrandt Films.
Oh, which I'm sure you all remember that name.
A little bit. Not really.
Rembrandt Films has done quite a few.
Yeah.
Quite a bit.
Well, also it was an adaptation of The Hobbit. We still haven't gotten to Lord of the Rings yet.
That's true.
It had a runtime of 12 minutes and is one of the shortest films, if not the shortest one, based off of Tolkien's work.
Which, even for The Hobbit, boy, they whittled that sucker down.
Oh, yeah.
They just shaved off everything.
Oh, yeah, because...
it's nice and trim.
Yeah, so the little story behind that one is after getting the lease on the rights in 1961, William L. Snyder, who would also later be a producer on the Popeye the Sailor show, commissioned cartoonist Gene Deitch to write the script and for a feature-length Hobbit cartoon. Deitch, who is known for Monroe, Tom and Jerry, or Tom Terrific, and Nudnik, also worked on Popeye, Tom and Jerry, and he took a lot of liberties with the source material.
Yeah.
And also as part, in fact, due to the rights that were given to Snyder, he was given full creative rights.
Which,
yeah. If you want, it is on YouTube.
You can watch it. I don't recommend it.
I watched it. There are some little things like Smaug is called Slag.
Yes.
And there's a lot more of that with the time of the hobbits being foretold, the trolls are groans, and my personal favorite, Gollum is Gollum.
I mean, both Gollum and Gollum are silly names, but we already had names picked out for everybody.
Yeah. Gollum at least sounds like some Nordic Viking shit.
Yeah, and like, Smaug is already a word. It's already a descriptive word.
Smaug.
Yeah, like, it's already a thing.
Yeah.
Like, I mean, this is sounding a whole lot like the reinterpretation of Aragon, the book series, into movie format.
Yeah. Well, my brother was a big fan of the book, and I know he was disappointed by the movie.
They literally changed the princess's entire race.
I know nothing about that series.
We need to rewatch that movie, and I will just yell at the screen for you the entire time. Don't worry.
I'm down. Finally, someone else ranting besides me.
This one Erica could rant on too. Don't worry. We'll have a night.
Okay, I'm down. But this work was never fully realized, and the reason we only have the 12 minutes is after a deal with 20th Century Fox fell through, Snyder and Deitch condensed the narrative down, as the original deal was for a color film of unspecified length to be screened in New York on June 30th, 1967, which was the last day before Snyder lost the rights and they would expire.
Yeah, this doesn't sound promising from the get-go.
Yeah, it was shown in a projection room in New York and had about 12 spectators who were given money for the admission fee.
I would say, is one of those spectators the janitor?
I don't know. They said they took random people and they just had to sign a document stating that they'd paid to see the film. That's why they were given the money up front.
Well, at least they were honest.
Yeah. Also, this film had remained unknown for most people until 2012, when Deitch posted it to his blog alongside the film's history.
At least he owns up to it.
Yeah, and some of his history is a little incorrect. He states it as coming out in 1966, but there's plenty of documentation saying it was 1967.
Yeah, well,
so, memory's a fickle thing.
It is.
Also of note, in 1964, the television rights for The Lord of the Rings had begun negotiations separately, and it was suggested to be adapted and aired on the new BBC Two. Mm-hmm. But again, like many of these first attempts, nothing came of it.
Yeah, well, I mean, I don't know. Maybe they just didn't want to risk it. Maybe they just didn't want to risk it. Maybe they just didn't want to risk it.
Yeah,
The TV one makes sense, though.
Yeah, especially for the 60s.
Yeah, like, it would have been an ambitious project.
Yeah, I mean, at that time, Doctor Who was ambitious.
And you gotta remember, this was old Doctor Who, not new Doctor Who.
Yes.
This was back when the fanciest technology that was on Doctor Who was a piece of plastic over the screen with a flashing thing on it.
Yeah.
That's how we made the monster appear.
Magic.
Magic.
And from here, Gelfman actually re-enters the picture after establishing Katska Bernie Productions with fellow producer Gabriel Katska, and they entered in negotiations with Tolkien to adapt the Lord of the Rings for United Artists with the potential for The Hobbit in 1967.
Yeah.
So they were looking ahead, like Lord of the Rings had taken off, and so they're like, well, we can do Lord of the Rings, and we might do a Hobbit down the line.
Which, I mean, is better forward thinking.
Exactly. To be fair, Lord of the Rings is more compelling than The Hobbit.
There is arguably more meat.
Yeah. But in this time, they were also given creative freedom and first bidding for television rights, but they never sold it to them.
Whoops.
And at this time, there was further growing interest in supposedly by MGM Disney, and as noted, a couple American teenagers were interested in getting the rights.
Yeah.
Didn't specify who or...
Just a couple teenagers were just like,
yeah,
our college program is going to be this.
Yeah, something
I mean,
like that.
Be ambitious. Be those college kids.
I mean, if Johnny Wiseau or Tommy Wiseau can make The Room...
We can do something.
Exactly.
Yeah.
But Katska Bernie had commissioned Sir Peter Schaeffer of Amadeus fame to write a 3-hour adaptation. Schaefer's script never took off, but United Artists still sold the rights in 1969, as well as the rights to sell to another studio. So they still bought the rights despite the project never taking off, basically.
I mean, people knew there was potential here. It was just really difficult potential.
It was whoever held the rights was going to have it.
Definitely.
And during this time as well, musician Arlo Guthrie pitched another animated feature, but was declined as United Artists wanted to make it a live action. So this is our first step from animated adaptations to live action.
Which is, at the time, significantly bumping the price from one to the other. This is before it was flipped.
Yep. And by this time in 1968, Tolkien was skeptical that a film adaptation would ever be made, and he stated, it's easier to film the Odyssey.
Which he's not wrong, because the Odyssey was a movie that came out before this.
Yeah, and also the Odyssey is a story.
With much more historical evidence of what things looked like.
Exactly, and you don't have to slip through the appendices. To be of note, the Silmarillion had still yet to come out.
Yeah, no one knew the history yet.
Yeah.
And also his journals hadn't been released.
No.
So, like, no one knew the full context still.
Yep. Also around this time, Apple Films, not part of Apple Computer,
a different Apple,
was looking to make a third film due to the Beatles' contract with United Artists. Head of Apple Films, Dennis O'Dell, came up with the idea after Yellow Submarine was not looking to be included in the 3-film deal.
Yeah, I can understand why.
Of which I also did not know the Beatles made movies.
There's a reason you didn't know that.
Yeah, I'm also not a Beatles fan, so I don't follow a lot of Beatles stuff.
As someone who, I wouldn't say I'm a Beatles fan, but I am married to one who used to be a Beatles fan and no longer is, because he burnt himself out on Beatles, I will let you know. There's a reason you don't know about the movies.
Okay, but those are for another time.
Exactly.
The original idea was to have the 4 Beatles play each of the Hobbits.
Each of the Hobbits, huh?
Well, yeah.
Which one's Ringo gonna be? Sam?
Well, that's the thing. Everyone wanted different roles.
Yeah, I can see how that would be a problem.
Yeah. And of shortlist directors included David Lean, Stanley Kubrick, and Michelangelo Antoni.
I mean, that's a good list.
Kubrick declined because he had trouble, or he deemed the books unfilmable despite loving them.
If Kubrick says this, you know you've reached something serious.
Well, and I think, part of it, not I think, it's guessed that part of this was due to the difficulties he's had making 2001: A Space Odyssey, another genre film. Which
I understand, and is a movie that I do like, and I watch regularly, And yeah, you can see where he ran into some walls.
Yeah.
There was some limitations that even he couldn't come over.
Oh yeah, I mean, we had to wait until CGI for this really to take fruition. I speak good words.
Yes.
And later, Chris Conklin, co-writer of the 1978 animated adaptation of Lord of the Rings, and Peter Jackson have both gone on record stating that if this was made during the time, it would have been tacky, and
it would have been weird.
In my opinion, it would have killed the series. I mean, it's 100% because the art director of Yellow Submarine, Heinz Edelman, had pitched the idea for an animated adaptation with the thought of direct adaptation not being possible, but he wanted to style it in like a Fantasia rock opera with, as he described, a Kurosawa-like aesthetic, or whatever the hell that means.
As someone who's seen plenty of Kurosawa films, I'm not sure if there's really an aesthetic there to pull from.
No,
I mean, there is a style, but I wouldn't say it's Kurosawa's.
Yeah, no, I don't know how. Honestly, I agree. I think it would have been tacky. It would have been horrible, and we probably wouldn't even have seen another Lord of the Rings adaptation.
With that said, though, now that all of the footwork is done, I would want to see that.
I would too. Just especially with all the bad stuff that's come out before and since it.
A rock opera interpretation of Lord of the Rings is really all I'm here for.
A prog rock.
A prog rock interpretation with some Japanese samurai nonsense thrown in.
Oh, can you imagine just Sting just being like a katana?
Yes, I can.
Oh, Gandalf comes in on like a shogunate horse and shit. Oh, that actually, I'd be down for that.
Yeah, but like after all of the other ones came out.
Yeah, exactly.
At least the decent animated ones, please.
Yeah. But also considered for casting was the Rolling Stones.
No, I'm good. I don't need that.
This is good. You're gonna like this even better. The script was actually written for it by John Borman of Zardos fame.
Oh no. Yeah, I don't think I needed this that bad. I mean, I do, but not in like at that time period.
I've got it. Sean Connery as Gandalf.
That's exactly who they would have cast.
Yes. Oh, that would have been. Well, no, he would have been too young. He probably would have been like Aragorn or someone.
He would have been a love interest. Yeah.
I kind of wish this had come to fruition a little bit.
I want them to retrospectively make this.
Yes.
I want someone now to take this concept and work with it.
We have the deepfake technology.
We have the technology.
Sean Connery as Aragorn.
Oh. I want to see it, but man, just really beating up one of my favorite characters here.
It'd be too much Highlander, I'd think.
It'd be a lot.
Yeah.
It'd be a lot.
Yeah, but unfortunately there was infighting of the Beatles who wanted to play different roles and not specifically be the Hobbits. And also their separation in 1970 killed this adaptation.
Yeah, I could see how that'd be a problem.
Yeah. And the final United Artists attempt was in 1969 when John Borman approached David Picker for an Arthurian epic and had intended to cast little people as the hobbits or children in beards and dubbed by adults.
I could see how that'd be a problem.
As someone who has seen Terror in Tiny Town,
yes you have.
I probably would enjoy this quite a bit.
There is a market for this. It is not the Lord of the Rings group.
No, not at all. But also, Al Pacino was considered for Frodo.
No, thank you. I do not need Al Pacino as Frodo.
And Sauron was described as looking Mick Jagger-like.
Okay, I can make the leap of faith for Mick Jagger as Sauron. I don't know if I can do Al Pacino as Frodo, though.
It might have been Sauron. I might have typed that wrong.
No, I think you typed it right. Only because I've done way too much digging into Lord of the Rings stuff recently, and I can see it. I'll let it happen. I don't like it.
Yeah.
But also, this is, again, before the other, like, information we know about this character has come out. They were taking a full stab in the dark. They did not know the rest of the information.
No. There's probably a lot of drugs.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Also later down, Borman realized this whole thing would have been a horrible idea too.
It would have been a garbage fire, but I would have enjoyed it.
Yep, and so partial rights were passed to Saul Zenitz. And now, yeah,
all right, yeah.
And he does play a part later on.
Yeah.
More so in the animated adaptations. But now is also a good point to bring up the various first live-action adaptations that started in the 70s.
Yes.
Most were unlicensed, and the first adaptation was the 1971 Swedish live-action television film Skan om ringen, which I should have asked the dude I know who knows Swedish to pronounce that, but close enough, I guess.
Don't worry, no one else is going to watch this.
No. It was separated into 2 parts, 2 13-minute episodes.
2 13-minute episodes. That's all of Lord of the Rings, huh?
It's better than a 12-minute adaptation of The Hobbit.
That's true.
But it was originally they said it's not available outside of Sweden. I found it on YouTube
yeah, you can totally watch it. Don't worry. It's not secret.
Yeah.
It's not safe.
But it was inspired by the prog rock album, which is why I brought prog rock up before. Music, the album, music inspired by Lord of the Rings by Bo Hansen, who also directed the movie.
Yeah, okay, that makes a lot more sense.
Yeah, and bit of trivia as well.
Yes.
The album was actually made under the license from the Tolkien estate.
Oh, so they own it now.
It's a pretty decent album.
I'll have to give it a go.
It's on Spotify.
Of course it is. I will give it a listen.
Yeah.
I watched the movie. Not worth it.
That's one of the or I'll count those as one. It's one of the 2 that I haven't seen so far.
Okay, I missed the Russian one.
That's the other one I haven't seen yet, which we'll get into.
I couldn't get a hold of the Russian version.
It's on YouTube.
I didn't find it. Dang it.
Yeah. Which finally we reached the first full animated feature with 1977 Rankin Bass adaptation of The Hobbit.
And as we all know, I love Rankin Bass.
Yes.
And their creepy animations.
Oh, yeah. Oh, I
own all 3 of these.
Actually, there's a bit of trivia you won't know about this, and I'll get into it in a minute.
Yes, tell me.
So the original Rankin Bass The Hobbit originated as an idea to make a series of television specials in 1972, but it was declined, and it was originally declined, but Rankin did point out that the books were in the public domain.
He's right.
Which is why they were able to start doing this, because there was a clerical error, and The Hobbit and I think The Lord of the Rings were all in the public domain for a number of years.
Which is weird to think about now, because everyone considers these books such classics. It's hard to imagine copyright problems.
Yep.
But yeah.
Yeah.
We had an oopsie, kind of like with Snoopy.
And with, what's the other one? Dawn of the Dead, or Night of the Dead.
Yeah.
Night of the Living Dead.
We knew what you meant.
Yeah. Eventually, Rankin Bass did reach an agreement with the Tolkien estate, and the special was announced in 1973, but it wouldn't air until 1977.
And it's a good thing that they came to that agreement, because for our parents, that's their introduction to Lord of the Rings for most of them. And
that was my understanding of Lord of the Rings as a kid, because our babysitter in Alaska had the movie, and that's how I was introduced to Lord of the Rings, not knowing really what it was. I had heard the name The Hobbit here and there as a kid.
Yeah, sure. But... I mean, by this point, Lord of the Rings words had entered into mainstream talk. Most people kind of had a concept of orc. Most people had a concept of hobbit or like halflings.
Yeah, especially with Dungeons and Dragons and whatnot.
Who were heavily inspired by Tolkien's work.
Yeah. And a little bit on this. Originally, Euronymation was to make it, but they bowed out, and Rankin Bass outsourced to a Japanese animation studio called Topcraft, who would in 1985 become the much-loved Studio Ghibli after making a little film called Nausicaa in the Valley of the Wind.
Oh, it all ties together.
Yeah.
Wonderful.
Yeah, there's some interesting stuff, and we're going to get into the bits you don't know.
Okay. I will say, I have 2 different versions of this, because there's the original one, and then later on, I think in the 90s, they re-released this one with corrected overtouches.
Okay.
So if you want a really fun drinking afternoon, the game to play is is everyone's eyes looking at the correct thing? If you can find the original version, the answer is no, and it will hurt you and you might go to the hospital. The recorrected one, they pretty much moved everyone's eyeballs so that they're looking in the same way.
That was a very rough New Year's Eve for me.
There's a lot of Coco Eye in the original animation.
That was the year before we started the podcast.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's a lot of Coco Eye happening.
And so in 1967, or 1976, we're past the 60s, Ralph Bakshi and then MGM president Dan Melnick bought the rights to The Lord of the Rings from United Artists and hired Chris Conkling to research the script. Bakshi is, for those who don't know, he is the writer and director of Fritz the Cat, Wizards, as well as the director of Cool World.
I like Cool World and Fritz the Cat.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of animated
titties. Yeah. Yeah. As for Melnick, I'm familiar with All That Jazz.
Yes.
Footloose.
Very good.
Altered States. Straw Dogs.
Yes.
And he also produced Westworld and the fantastic film Network as the head of MGM.
Hey, I mean, our rap sheet's starting to look really good.
Yeah. Like I said, there's a lot of people involved in this, and why I wanted to bring some of what else they've done. A lot of this was afterwards, but still, they knew kind of what they were doing a little bit.
Yeah.
And this is also where our first hints of a 3-film structure came into concept, but they couldn't get the middle film to fit the way they wanted it to work.
Which makes sense, especially if you've read the books. The middle book always kind of fits weird. Mm-hmm. Like, the story flows in such a way that you kind of need to just constantly be reading.
Oh, yeah. Fun fact about this one, it was the longest animated film of the time.
Yes. Very impressive.
Yep. And as well, there is a sequel that was in the works, but was never finished. And even in 2000, Bakshi was still wanting to make it.
I would still want it.
Yeah. Now, we return to we go to 1980, where Rankin Bass adapted The Return of the Kings.
Also have that one.
Also made by Topcraft. I don't think you were aware that all those 3 collections you have, only 2 of them were made by Rankin Bass. Other Hobbit was made by someone else.
Yes, it is. And it's weird because now that you say that, you can tell.
Mm-hmm.
It is visually starkly different.
Yeah.
But because you are sold the concept of this being a set, you just kind of run with it.
Yeah. No, exactly. And it also explains, because I remember we were sitting there drinking and yelling at the screen of,
it's infuriating.
Why Gollum looks like a ball sack.
He does look like a ball sack.
Gollum.
Tiny teeth.
Even the change of the name, he's not called Gollum in the movie, but the name Gollum sounds like the saggy ball sack version of Gollum.
Yes, it does. And that is an accurate representation of what the animated Gollum looks like. Oh, no.
Yeah, and so now we're entering the era of Lord of the Rings that we're most familiar with.
This is the golden age, one might say.
Yes. And also in 1985, we have the Soviet Union airing of The Fabulous Journey of Mr. Bilbo Baggins the Hobbit, that had been shot in 1984 and aired up into the 90s.
I'm not gonna lie, that title's good.
That's
a good title.
Yeah,
that's so much better than
The Hobbit.
The Hobbit.
Yeah, if you don't know what a Hobbit is...
that's a good point. What is a Hobbit?
Yeah, Mr. Bill... It makes me think of... what's that? There's some Amazon show like Miss Marple or something.
Yes, The Amazing Miss Marple.
Yeah, so it makes me think of that kind of elongation of the name.
Yeah, I don't know. It also just kind of fits the Hobbit vibe. Doesn't really fit the Lord of the Rings later version, so I can see why everyone else was like, no, we don't want to go with a cutesy name.
Yeah.
But for the Hobbit, it works.
Well, and the Hobbit was a kid's movie, so...
Yeah, a very sad, devastating children's book.
I mean...
Long, hard-to-read children's book. But it was, he meant it as a kid's book.
Yeah, exactly.
He just had very high expectations of this children's reading level.
Yeah. As well, in 1991, there was the Soviet Union aired an adaptation of The Fellowship of the Ring called, and I'm going to butcher this one.
Go for it, try.
Cranitelli.
Probably very wrong.
Probably very Italian.
Probably very Italian pronunciation of that Russian word there.
Yes. Which only aired once and was thought to have been lost until it was rediscovered in 2021.
I freaking love rediscovered movies.
I do too.
I love the concept of someone just cleaning out their grandma's closet and being like, hey, found a movie.
Yeah.
That hasn't been seen in 60 years.
Like the mystery tape that you got that we looked it up and it's actually a movie, but we're scared to still play it.
Yes, I received a VHS player as a gift from a friend's mother, who I didn't know her, and it was like a long chain to get this sucker in college, and it came with a taped over old home VHS thing with a very suspicious title written in handwriting on the side.
Yeah, it's called what? The Mating Habits of Modern Humans or
something
shit?
like that. And it was sketchy enough, and I did not know this friend's mother well enough to play the tape.
No.
I don't know if I still have it.
I think I saw it on your shelf, and I've offered to watch it.
One of these days I will balls up and watch it, hoping that this is the movie that Wikipedia tells me that it is.
You will gloom up?
I will.
And so also in 1991, production started on a stop motion Hobbit cartoon, but it was never fulfilled. It's called The Treasure Under the Mountain.
Okay, a stop motion would be really good though.
Yeah, unfortunately 6 minutes exist.
Okay, that's a lot.
Ooh, here's what I think would be interesting.
Mm-hmm.
The people from Kubo and the Two Strings.
Yes, their studio is fantastic. Yeah. Yes.
And I think they would do it justice. I think they would find a cool art style, and then they'd run with it.
Yes. Same studio who did Paranorman. Yes, their style is fantastic.
Mm-hmm.
I can understand why no one has attempted this yet, though, because stop animation takes for frickin' ever.
Oh, yeah.
Granted, we're not waiting on a sequel to come out for The Hobbit, so, there's that.
I mean...
Not really.
We're waiting on prequels now.
Yeah, but that's different. We all know that they're taking some liberties.
You know what I think would actually be an interesting prequel? Legolas and Aragorn prequel. Of them doing their ranger shit.
That would be interesting.
Yeah.
That would be interesting. I want a post adaptation of just Legolas and Gimli shenanigans and across to the Middle Earth. Because they did go on a vacation together for a long time.
Yeah, for a few hundred years before returning to the Grey Havens.
Yeah, I would like that bro adventure.
Yeah.
It's just a buddy travel duo across Middle Earth.
Yeah, that'd be interesting.
Especially because they don't have their mom friend Aragorn there to get them out of trouble.
True.
They're just two dudes.
Two
dudes on one horse.
An elf and a dwarf overcoming the odds.
Yes. I would watch
an unlikely friendship.
I would watch this entire TV show, and I hate TV shows.
I would too. But then in 1995, Peter Jackson enters the picture.
And we all had high hopes.
Yeah, and I'm going to go into a little bit of history. Like I said, we're going up until New Line takes over.
Yes.
Because that's when the production really, really started.
Yes.
So, in 1995, Peter Jackson pitched the idea of an adaptation, both The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit, to Miramax.
Yep.
Jackson also researched and learned from the mistakes of the previous failed projects, and he had been toying with a trilogy, stating that starting with The Hobbit and then splitting The Lord of the Rings into two parts.
Yes.
So we were still going with a trilogy, but in a different format than what we were thinking.
And I can understand this original thinking process.
Mm-hmm.
This makes sense from a very pulled back standpoint.
Yeah.
The 3 number is good.
Yeah.
And The Hobbit's clearly on its own, and you could argue that you can get Lord of the Rings trilogy into 2 parts pretty nicely, actually.
Yeah.
Story-wise, that's the good break, is 2 parts, not 3. But there's so much.
Oh, yeah. Well, and on top of that, the biggest issue was getting the rights to The Hobbit.
Yes.
Because it was too difficult, as the rights were split between Zaints and United Artists. Again, that's why I brought him up, because...
They're still holding it.
Yeah. Or I don't know if he does anymore. I haven't done any research.
I think Hobbit is now fully in the hands.
Okay. Yeah, I don't know. That's something to dig up for when we do The Hobbit eventually.
Very much so.
But Miramax at this time wasn't keen on making a trilogy. Because, one, the expense.
Yeah.
And also its parent company, Disney, declined additional funding when the Weinsteins pretty much told and at that point, make what you will with the Weinsteins. That's neither here or there.
Yes.
They basically told Jackson that they were only going to make a single 2-hour film, or he would have to find another studio.
So he found another studio.
Yeah. Basically what happened, they also threatened to have Hossein Ami, who was writer of the films Four Feathers, Drive, Snow White and the Huntsman, 47 Roman, and recently the shitty horror film that I have yet to watch, The Snowman.
I love all of these, but because I love all of these, that should be a red flag.
Yeah, they were saying, oh, he's going to write them, but then they also threatened to replace him with John Madden or Tarantino as director.
Don't get me wrong. I love Tarantino. Tarantino would be a terrible choice.
Yes, exactly.
There'd be too much feet.
Yeah.
There'd be too much emphasis on the Hobbit. Feet.
Yeah. Oh, God. For those who don't know, we are recording this right after recording our Fast and the Furious episode where we talk about feet a bit.
Yes. Because Tarantino forces us all to.
The 4 degrees of Tarantino feet. Or no, the 4 feet of Tarantino. And also Jackson's mentioned that he believes these were empty threats.
Oh, I completely agree with him there, but at the same time, these are also people dumb enough to do empty threats.
Yeah. And to Jackson's credit, he did give it a 90-page treatment, but he said it was unfilmable.
I 100% agree.
Yeah, for those who don't know, 90 pages in a standard script again is about an hour and a half.
Yeah, which then leaves you about the 30 minutes you need to pad out for here and there.
Yeah, action and all that stuff too.
Pan shot.
Credits and whatnot.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. And so Jackson did reach out to Robert Zemeckis, who at this point had directed all 3 of the Back to the Future movies and Who Framed Roger Rabbit.
Reggie
Rabbit. I can speak so well after all that food.
Yeah, it was delicious.
It was good. But reached out to Universal, DreamWorks, Fox, Sony.
Pretty much everybody.
Centropolis, all who declined.
I mean, I can understand though, like, this is an enormous undertaking. And all of those studios had other giant projects they were dealing with.
Yep. And on top of that, Harvey Weinstein had limited the turnaround to 3 weeks, or Jackson would have to do a 1-film version.
Oh.
Yeah. But in 1999, New Line Cinema assumed production responsibilities. And when the idea was pitched to the executives, because they were asking for more money, the guy sits there and as Jackson says in the commentary for The Lord of the Rings, they pitched it to him and the guy's like, well, he just sat there silently. And so they're like, shit, we blew this. This isn't going to ever come to fruition. He's like, why are we making 2 when it should be 3?
And those were the best words any man has ever said.
Yep. And that is where we will leave off.
Yes.
As we kick off our Lord of the Rings 6-part episode.
Woohoo!
I've been looking forward to this for a long time.
Me too. This is one of my favorite movie franchises of all time.
Oh, same here. And honestly, I really hope that people enjoy the history of these adaptations, just because I feel it's something that's not talked about as much in the lead up, because most of the special features and everything you see is, as it should be, focused around the creation.
Material. Yeah, which is interesting, and there's so much there.
Mm-hmm.
But yeah, if you haven't tried to get your hands on some of this original stuff, like I've been listening to some of the original radio productions. Some are arguably better than others.
Mm-hmm.
Some are dry.
Yeah.
Some of them not that bad.
Yeah,
listenable.
Yeah, and there were many radio adaptations that came out before any of the animated features did at all.
Yeah. The one I liked was actually from the 80s, and the one from the 60s isn't terrible either. The one from 55, just boring.
Yeah.
It's a little dry.
Well, and that's the thing. And before we get into Peter Jackson stuff and the upcoming weeks, and that's another thing just to keep everyone in the know, we are doing an episode a week for the next month and a half.
Yeah, because it's Lord of the Rings.
Yeah, didn't want to spread it out over 3 months.
It would have been arguably too long.
Yeah, like some other adaptations. But yeah, I mean, I think it's important to know like how troubled the development of a Lord of the Rings adaptation really was. And
how weirdly, like, everyone who is a Lord of the Rings fan has complained about the recent ones.
Mm-hmm.
And there's some good arguments there, for sure. But also to have a time to step back and look at how impossible having this movie looked for years.
Yeah, especially like once you start getting into the nitty-gritty of like the 70s adaptations, the 60s and 70s, where it's like, well, we'll have these big name icons on it. And honestly, that would have been the same thing. Same issue with Fast and the Furious.
Yes.
where they stepped away and wanted to do up-and-coming actors. The Hobbits, or I'm sure there's a band called the Hobbits.
I hope there is.
The Beatles, honestly, I think would have killed it. Because people would have gone for the Beatles themselves and not the Lord of the Rings.
Yes.
Same with the Rolling Stones.
Yep. And all of these, by this point, they weren't up-and-coming underground bands. They weren't even, like, mildly famous bands. This was the end of their careers.
Yeah, or...
For the Beatles, anyway.
Yeah, it's the middle of the Rolling Stones shit, so...
Which, for their health and mindset, we could argue is the middle.
Yeah, and so, I mean, that's what the Spotlight is. It's not to really review anything, or just to more so discuss. And honestly, I do give credit for trying to condense The Hobbit down into such short time frames of the ones I've seen.
Yeah.
Or Lord of the Rings in general. Just condensing it down into short feelings, basically.
Which I can totally understand, and depending on the time and the medium, I agree with. I think, though, as we're going to see going forward, the depth of the Lord of the Rings, what Tolkien created, is really what people are interested in. And that has what has led to not just these original adaptations, but the amount of fan work before the Peter Jackson stuff. Like, if you're bored, there is an endless amount of Lord of the Rings style and setted pieces that not even just are fan fictions, but made it into general publications. Yeah. And they're good, most of them. Some of them are bad, but most of them are pretty good because it's the root, it's the foundation that's solid. Yeah, and I think it really shows not just that, but like the advances in cinema that took us to even get to this point. There was definitely a moment where we could not have created this. Yeah, because especially if the Beatles had made a Lord of the Rings, in between them and Peter Jackson's, we had Fifth Element, we had Star Wars, we had so many groundbreaking visually effects movies. And I think about the original Star Wars and how, looking back on that, how you cringe at how some of the puppetry is done and how much we've had to go back and fix. Yeah. Even within its own lifeline. Yeah. And imagine the difference between that and what the Beatles could have done with a version of the Lord of the Rings. We all live in a hole in the ground, a hole in the ground. I don't know how that song goes. That's the only part I know. That's okay. That's all you really need. Yeah, so again, I hope everyone enjoyed this spotlight. I mean, it was interesting for us to go down and not deep dive as we normally do. It was more of a cursory look. We didn't want to bog everyone down with every single little detail because honestly, there is a lot we cut and had to narrow down. There's so much to go through, and we found this beginning stuff so interesting, especially because when we were first talking about this, we did consider just going over the animated ones. Yeah, because as bad as some of the moments are in them, they're a solid movie. Yeah, and honestly, they're worth their own review. I think so too. But if you haven't seen them, get your drinks ready. Get your shot glasses prepared. Go have some fun. Yeah. So, anywho, this has been the Good, the Bad, and the Weird Spotlights. Thanks for listening. Peace.